So it's all about what you're trying to get out of the question. So ask a follow-up, basically, is what you're saying.
Yeah, so yes. So
Okay.
I'm more interested in what actually triggered for people. Where was it? Was it that, oh, everybody was so nice to me and they made me feel so welcome, or we found something for everybody to do, or it's just cool stuff to touch and do and see, or it fed our interest, or I want to know what was fun, and is there a pattern in that fun? So if you just talk to a few people, you're just going to see that everybody had a different answer. But if you talk to enough people across time, then you start to see that, wow, we get a big hit here in this particular, everybody mentions a certain experience or mentions that everybody was friendly, or you start to see, well, what is it? What's the pattern of fun? So I guess for me, asking fun is great, but then asking the next level of question. So if you're doing interviews, certainly that's a great way to have a conversation, and you do have to pull people out because they say, it was fun. Why? Well, it was fun because it was fun. Great. Tell me more. And some people, it's very hard to pull that out because all they remember is it was good. It was like we were talking before, yeah, I remember the guy and I remember liking it. I just don't remember what it was. So we're all inarticulate on some level. And that's the main thing about fun.
And you mentioned just now, if you have enough data, how do you know what enough is?
What is enough?
What is enough?
Yeah. Well, there's all kinds of literature on that, so you can go and find what the big boys say. I've also found that it varies across who you're talking to, and what I use as a rule of thumb is, when do I start to see patterns I can rely on? So one way I think about it is that if I dip in and I get this information from 20 people, and I see maybe what looks like a pattern, that's a very small sample, but I see what looks like a pattern. If I go and do another 20 people, will that pattern look the same? So in other words, back to the fun question, if people start to define what fun is, and I see that out of these 20 people, half of them say everyone was so nice to me and I felt so welcomed, and then 5 people said, oh, it was the things I got to touch and do, and then there was a smattering of other things. If I drew out another 20 people, would it be roughly the same breakdown? Or I like to say same picture, because I see it as a curve or the charts, and I see, does it look like the same shape? So that means that you need enough that you start to be sure that the shape is consistent. So if I do 20 and then I do another 20, chances are that shape of the way the data plays out is not going to look the same. I'm going to get on this 20, half of them just loved the way they were treated. And on the other one, it wasn't that it was a problem, but everybody mentioned something else because maybe something else was going on during that 20 people. So then if I have those 40 and I go get another 40, maybe the shapes start to look the same. Does that make sense? So for me, it's not a definitive number. They usually say, supposedly you have to have 10 to run a t-test or a statistical test, but I think that's too few. So I'm just not comfortable with tiny, tiny numbers. That puts a hardship on practitioners because you're already doing too much. You're already overbooked. So how do you then get more data?
And is that a point in time where you call in a professional? I know there's money issues, of course, but when do you call a professional as opposed to go ahead and take it upon yourself?
Well, I think the field is shifting some. When I first started doing this in the 90s and I started talking about getting practitioners to do their own evaluation, I got some pushback of like, that's just not appropriate. And I realized that in some cases I have to be very sensitive to your already busy schedules. And so I think that you can do a lot of the front end and exploratory, what they call front end or formative. It's you're just exploring. You're not trying to do the definitive research. You're not doing full research. That's where I use that term thinking evaluatively. You're just trying to apply evaluative concepts to your practice? How do you know what you know? And that's where, when you start to ask questions like, well, I got this data and everybody's having fun, but I don't know what to do with it. Then that's thinking evaluatively. It's like, well, what can I do with that? And what else do I need to know to make that useful for me? So when to call somebody in, I think when you want to do really big summative studies and you need a large sample, that's helpful. But in front-end informative, you can also often get a little bit of data and start to say, oh, we're starting to see patterns. So, for example, if everybody in your department went out and had an interview with 3 people, and you had 5 people that would give you 15 interviews, and you sat around the table and told stories, swapped stories, right? Well, I had this. Oh, I did too. And so you're getting a sense of how visitors are talking about this, and then you would sit and say, well, do we feel comfortable about what this pattern is, or do we need to go do one more round of this so you feel comfortable about what's going on? You don't have to crunch that data. You don't have to do anything with it. It takes a relatively small amount of time from staff. I like to get all staff in, support staff, security staff, people who don't normally go out and talk to visitors. It can do more to shift the organization. So then bringing the outside evaluator in, if you're doing a big project, it's good to bring them in early, not bring them in, oh gosh, we collected all this data, now do something with it. Because everybody kind of wants to have a hand in how that data is collected.
My question was, if we're asking families and visitors to sort of unpack the notion of fun and what it was that triggered their experience of the fun, what are sort of possible suggestions if families are very pressed for time? Like, as a facilitator, a lot of facilitators aren't necessarily comfortable being evaluators. What might be good tips to sort of get a family to answer these questions and not feel like you're eating up too much of their time?
Yeah, it's a common question that practitioners have about, well, I'll be imposing upon people. And I've thought about this a lot, especially when I first got into this kind of work. And I always, before I start the first interview when I'm on the floor, always, even now that I've done this now 20 years, I swallow hard and I say, oh crap, they're not going to want to talk to me. And I'm going to be imposing, and they're busy, and I have all these little monsters on my shoulders saying, don't do this, don't do this. And I always jump in and I just go, oh, it's like the cold water. It's not so cold. It feels pretty good. Splash around. People love to be engaged in meaningful conversation. And also when you truly listen to them and you're interested in what they have to say, and that's where my approach is very conversational. I want to know how your experience is. I'm not asking you, firing a bunch of questions at you of, do you love us and how much do you love us, and tell me more about how you love us, and will you come back and will you tell people about us, and it's all about me, do you love me? But really curious about their experience, that then you realize that this is important for them. And I've had people, when I've interviewed them in museums, say, thank you, this was really interesting. I enjoyed this, helped me think about my experience differently. Well, for me, coming at it as an educator, that rings my bells right there. And I get great data, but I also have had a nice educational experience for that person and for me. So I think we also have to get over some of our early training. So many of us have been taught to not be nosy, don't ask questions, give people their privacy. I think that's a cultural thing often. You don't go in right away and say, tell me about your breakup, or something like that. So we have this problem of our mothers on our shoulders saying, don't do that. And once I think about it differently, is that I'm honoring this person by listening to what they have to say. I'm respecting them. I care about what they have to say. Then we just have a great time, and I come away saying, I love people. They're so interesting. And they have so much to say and so many great experiences, and I always learn something. And invariably, I come away from these conversations and I've got a couple of ideas for new books to read. And so if you do the interview, yes, I think it's imposing. I don't like having questions fired at me. Mm-hmm. But if I come in with a question or a prompt that is intriguing and innately interesting to that person, then they will take over, and all I have to do is listen and go, really? Tell me more. How fascinating. You know?
Do you prototype, so to speak, your evaluation instruments to get to a point that you're asking those questions?
Yeah, I have to test. I make up questions at my computer, and then I get on the floor and they don't work as well as I think they will, or they need a little tweaking, or I need a question before that to get people into it. Or I realized, like in the early days of apps, I was testing something about apps, and I realized, when I got on the floor after talking to a few people, is I need to first ask, do you know what an app is? And now, of course, everybody does, but at the time, I would say at least a half really had not gotten into that. So yeah, I have to test, and I would say particularly what I try to engage practitioners in doing, because as much as I try to avoid this written questionnaire, I understand it's easier, but they are easier to administer than interviews, but they're the hardest to do well, and so you really have to test it. And the best way to develop a written survey is to have a series of conversations with people around the questions to find out how do they think about these things. What I might use a phrase, and we use a lot of in-speak, and we use a phrase that normal people will just look at you and go, it's like, I don't understand what you're talking about. So when I have conversations, I begin to understand how they think about it and what matters. So if I want to give people choices, I start to have conversations around these things and ask them questions about it, and then things emerge, so I then develop my choices for them to rank or choose or rate in some way. Yes, so prototyping or testing instruments is incredibly important. As we found out, testing an instrument over a year or two, it's not uncommon to get something really good then.
And what you're saying brings up in my mind, if we're talking to a bunch of, as disseminating this project, to professionals who are trying to develop an engaging intergenerational program, what we ran into is we couldn't just ask, were you engaged? Was everybody in your family engaged? Because we had a very specific idea of what we meant. Mm-hmm. But again, it's like using that lingo. Mm-hmm. It makes sense to us, but it made no sense, or it made sense to the public, but they were like, oh, I did something where I watched, so I was engaged. Yeah, sure.
Right.
So I don't know if you have any...
well, and that word engaged, words get tired so quickly, and it goes back to that issue of what's the difference between learning and engagement. And I remember working with some museum professionals once, and I kept using the term, and she said, I'm sorry, all I can think of is the big engagement ring. And so after that I thought, well, okay, what does it mean? And when you look up the word, it's about being interested, involved, committed, all of those really good things. And so I think sometimes we have to give deeper thought to the language we use. And engaged is, for me, kind of in-speak. It's not, if you think about a visit, an experience you had when you were a kid, and if someone had asked you that question, sometimes I have to say, can I answer the question as a visitor? And I'm not sure I would say engaged. And even now, knowing what I know and doing what I do, when I take my grandkids out for a thing, I'm not thinking about how engaged are we. It's more holistic than that. So I think we have to find better language. And also if we give people, that's where talking with people, we start to know what are the different ways they are engaged. So if you go back to a lot of the frameworks we've worked on and other research, it's like, is that it was a rich sensory experience. So a lot of families will talk about, I like this because there were just lots of opportunities to learn through the senses, learning by doing. They use the term hands-on all the time. We might be tired of that term, but it's something they use. So you have to figure out how, and I wouldn't even use the term rich sensory experience with families, because that's geek speak for me. But it's like, that's where opportunities to learn by touching, by doing, by seeing, by hearing, by dancing, by moving, that kind of thing. A lot of the families will say, adults will say, well, I loved this experience because it inspired us, or it tapped into our creativity, and a lot of your things are about teamwork, like we learned to work together. And so for me, I have to get pretty specific in that language, that there was something for everybody, that everybody had a good time, that everybody felt like they were, that their interest and needs were accommodated in some way. So sometimes it's like, well, I'm having a great time if I just had a place to sit while the kids and the younger people were enjoying themselves, and I got a good vantage point to watch.
So we could ask what could make it better for you, or something like that.
Yeah, that's a common question, and some people can answer it, but I think what you have to do is look at the answers you're getting. So if most of the answers you're getting are, nothing, you guys are perfect, you're great, and is it their job to tell me how to do my job better? I mean, I don't want to throw that baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. I don't want to say never ask that question, but I would like to give them more specifics to respond to. Like, here's some things we're thinking about. What do you think about those? We're thinking about adding this and this, or we're thinking about doing this, or how do you feel about that? It's just when you're asked, especially if you're doing it on a survey, a written survey, I wouldn't ask a lot of open-ended questions, because I think about it, it's not the place to really think and write, especially if you're doing a paper survey right there and the kids are swarming around your knees and I've got to go, and I'm just not being very thoughtful. Sometimes if it's an online survey, if you can get them to open the link, then you can get them to do a little bit of thinking. But I like to try to make it as easy for them as I can.